In the past 3 months, I've read about 20 full-size Warhammer 40k novels, and although I enjoyed them and have downloaded 20 more, I can't shake this weird feeling. This feeling that I'm sort of wasting my time. A part of it is no fault of the novels themselves or of the lore, but rather the real-life knowledge that I have of their production and Games Workshop as a company. To get the obvious stuff out of the way, Games Workshop and Black Library have a very intricate arrangement. They employ numerous authors that oftentimes write sequels and prequels to each other. Different writing styles, visions, interpretations of characters, and so on. This phenomenon can be felt directly while reading the books themselves, and they can have a tangible impact on your enjoyment. Add to this the need for lore consistency for a setting that's been around for almost half a century across multiple media, and you get the idea. Despite the severity of how this sounds, however, I found that it's the least of my issues with Warhammer lore and novels. If I read an author whose writing style I don't really enjoy, or the subject matter is something I don't find interesting, then this is a self-contained issue that concerns that specific book or series. After all, Warhammer, and especially 40k, is more of a platform than it is a story. Be that as it may, as consumers, readers, and tabletop players, what we want are stories. We love overarching narratives and intricate plotlines that provide meaning. This is the case if you enjoy the miniatures and the tabletop, as the lore provides creative value and deepens your interest in your faction, and this goes double if you're only interested in the books and have no contact with the tabletop or painting. If that is the case, then all you have are the overarching plotlines, or lack thereof. The reason I'm saying this is because you can only have a certain amount of standalone novels about the same thing. You can only have a certain number of fights in a row, or seemingly important characters and plotlines vanishing in the next book as if they never existed. A book may have been interesting while reading it, but if you get disappointed by the lack of a fulfilling follow-up, how many times can you go through this process before giving up entirely, or severely lowering your expectations? This seems all the more prevalent whenever the stakes are raised. In any good story, there need to be some stakes, something, anything hanging in the balance. In Warhammer, this is usually the fate of the galaxy as a whole or a specific faction, such as the Imperium. This commonly starts as something small, perhaps Chaos going after an ultra-powerful artifact, attempting to conquer a path through Terra, and so on. Ultimately, however, we all know that the Imperium can't die, nor can it ever win. Every victory and every loss for every faction is abstract due to the sheer scale of the galaxy and the setting. A planet was lost, so what? There's another million. Even with something as radical as the Great Rift, the galaxy splitting in two, and half of it living in darkness, what actually changed? Unknown planets and untold billions were destroyed. In 40k, this doesn't hit as hard. Not to mention that, more often than not, our protagonists have still been able to traverse the warp in Imperium Nihilus because of A, B, and C that was just made up on the spot and invalidates everything. This is where it gets even more complicated. As we've said so far, the main issue a lot of people have are the lack of real stakes, both practically in the books and in real life due to knowledge of how GW works, in combination to a lack of a coherent vision and a satisfying overarching narrative, which is obviously connected to the lack of stakes. The issue is that there can't be any real stakes when the novels and the lore are so interconnected to GW's main business, which is the selling of plastic. Gilliman can be resurrected and therefore sold, but how easily can GW kill him off? How easily can GW kill any of the named characters we know and love, when people keep buying them and are already very committed to the armies they've spent a fortune and hundreds of hours on? The only way to fix that problem is by somehow disconnecting the lore and the plastic, so that each can exist supplementary to one another as opposed to dependently. I mean, the primaries themselves are the primary symptom of this lore and plastic interconnectivity. Instead of simply scaling up the plastic to the proportions they wanted, they created this whole storyline of Belisarius Cawl working on them and Guilliman for 10,000 years, something that came out of nowhere. Initially, the primaries were a completely distinct entity to the Firstborn, and the books even hinted at the primaries solving the genetic flaws of the chapters, thus adding stakes, only to walk back on both of those things. The first because it was insane for the tabletop, and the second because the genetic flaws are what makes the chapters unique. And now the lore is leaning toward the primaries' genetic flaws being even worse than the Firstborn, an unsatisfying back and forth that gets all the more confusing while moving from novel to novel, and which can find its origins in corporate indecisiveness. Additionally, and this is something I hinted at earlier, the only way to find stakes in a setting such as 40k is necessarily with an end times type scenario. Primarchs coming back, something like the Indomitus Crusade and the Great Rift shaking things up, and not to mention countless hints of the Emperor stirring and the Golden Throne failing. These can only lead to a massive scale conflict and potential reset. If they don't, then what was the point of mentioning them so extensively and endlessly teasing people with galactic scale events? This right there is exactly the type of stakes I was talking about. The ultimate showdown between the factions is the only thing that can keep the narrative's overarching story intense. Short of that, and it's more of the same. The Warhammer fantasy shaped hole in that plan is that the chances of a 40k reset and ending satisfying even 50% of the community are next to nothing. Even though Age of Sigmar has gotten a lot more popular and original Warhammer Fantasy ended under an incredible behind-the-scenes rush, the danger that the end times pose to 40k cannot be overstated. The Emperor returning, the Loyalist Primarchs battling chaos alongside Xenos, and so on. It would be incredibly difficult to get right, and even if you do write the masterpiece, people will still be left disappointed over their own faction being destroyed. You simply can't win. Not to mention, it would be difficult to see what even happens in a post-40k setting. Ultimately, the only way to keep things interesting is by first managing expectations, and most importantly, not going all out while not willing to follow up. If you're willing to mention a magical weapon, make sure it's impactful. If you want to raise the stakes and have beloved characters die, or even familiar planet lost, then build them up across multiple books, and then don't be afraid to do what is necessary. Something that can only be done if you explicitly don't make those characters a part of the tabletop. Good characters can't deepen interest in a faction without having a miniature, and in this way, there can be a win-win. Book readers have their stakes, tabletop players and lore enjoyers can have more faction content, and their miniatures aren't wasted. But this is difficult and it takes time. More often than not in Warhammer books, characters tend to die either too soon or not at all. There needs to be a middle ground, so that people can have enough time with a character to be immersed, while also feeling the tension of their potential death. In terms of larger scale narratives, which are the main issue, a few things can be done. The first would be, like I said, somehow distancing the lore from having a one-to-one impact on the tabletop, which would be difficult to do and a massive decision. The second, and the most doable, is to simply follow through. Perhaps not to the extent of end times, but at the bare minimum, if you're willing to mention something insane, then you must be willing to provide a resolution to the insanity. Lean more into character-driven stories and experiences. Focus on their campaigns and expeditions, or hidden maneuvering from certain factions. Be willing to make changes to the landscape of the story in small steps. 40k can be grimdark without it being stationary in fear of messing up the plastic selling business. After all, change doesn't mean progress. But without change, there are no stakes, and without stakes, you have no story. I'm not a writer, but as a consumer of the miniatures, books, TV shows, and video games, I think at the bare minimum, this is the mentality GW should have. And from that mentality of adding more weight to their promises within the books, I think we may get more of what we want. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.